Welcome to Tony Hawk. In 1999, the world was forever changed with the release of a little game that's located right here that's kind of hard to see. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. That's when that wonderful game released and changed the world as we know it in more ways than one. This video game was made from the legendary team up between skateboarding legend Tony Hawk and the now infamous game developer Neversoft. The game was fun, full of replayability. And one of the reasons why people replayed it over and over and over again was because it had a legendary, amazing soundtrack. The soundtracks from these games right here, these things shaped a generation, and people often look back at these games right here as being some of the most unique and wonderful sounds they've heard from not just like Tony Hawk games or skateboarding games, but from gaming in general. These things are such highly regarded for their soundtracks.
So to me, what makes a great Tony Hawk soundtrack is honestly one that you're never gonna hate a song on, which is a really tough thing to do, but Tony Hawk Pro Skater and Pro Skater 2 and I think Underground all had songs that I just fell in love with the moment I heard them. More so the ones from like Goldfinger and Less Than Jake. It's just great to hear songs that, you know, you don't normally hear on the radio, I guess, because like where I grew up, radio was all about like, you know, either your country songs or your pop songs or your like 80s hits or your now hits, I suppose. Rancid and Primus and Rage Against the Machine and Public Enemy, these were all bands that I had never ever heard of before. So you just gotta have those bands that I think you know you're going to be introducing people to for the first time, and then, you know, have some other bands that have some name recognition on them too.
Hello, I'm GRIZZLYSTATION, and my fine friend Garrett from Cactus Malpractice asked me what makes a good Tony Hawk playlist. A kick-ass Tony Hawk soundtrack will have genres ranging from 80s to 90s punk to 90s underground rap to heavy metal to third wave ska. It's something that would put you in the mood of the game with either raucous pumpin' music while you're launching some sweet-ass kickflip Supermans with Steve Caballero, or something that would chill you out as you skate the streets pulling a ghetto tag grind off the sidewalk as Chad Muska. It's just fun music! Music that is fun, that's what makes a great Tony Hawk soundtrack! And I'm sure Garrett's already talked your gosh darn ear off about it. Okay, Garrett, can I see my kids now?
So today I am determining which song is the best off every soundtrack. Now, to determine which songs are the best songs from every soundtrack, I added some parameters for all the songs to try to hit. So it can be considered the best one off the soundtrack. So here are those parameters right now. Number 1, does it feel like a Tony Hawk game? Number 2, is it fun to skate to? Number 3, does it fit the game's overall theme? Number 4, is the track interesting? And finally, number 5, which is the most important one, I like it. Today, we are going to be looking at every single soundtrack from the Tony Hawk series. Now, at first, I thought that was going to be a very easy thing. I have every single game from the mainline series, but it's not that easy. There are so many different ports and so many games that I've never even heard of from the Tony Hawk franchise, and it turns out this thing is a lot crazier than I first imagined. But I did it. I listened to every single song that these games have to offer, and oh my god, it's a wild ride. So sit back and relax, get a soft drink, it's gonna be a hot second. We're gonna start where everything should start, from the beginning. We're gonna talk about Tony Hawk Pro Skater, released in 1999. So the first one, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, was a very, very rock and ska-centered little soundtrack. It only had 10 songs in the original release. On the PAL version, it had 3 more songs added to it, and those songs had to replace several different songs off the standard release. The top 3 songs I listened to off the original soundtrack, including the PAL songs, I think the number 3 song was going to be Ain't Got Time to Waste, AIM featuring YZ. It was kind of weird that in the first Tony Hawk game there was no rap at all. It was just hard rock, some ska. There was no real break from that format. So I really like how in the PAL regions they gave you some more hip hop, which I think is a wonderful breath of fresh air. So it gets to the number 3 spot. New Girl by the Suicide Machines is my number 2 spot. And finally, my number 1 pick for Tony Hawk Pro Skater, Superman by Goldfinger. I think that goes as no surprise because this is pretty much the theme song for the entire Tony Hawk series. They named the documentary of the entire game franchise after this song. So yeah, I think it's a shoo-in for number 1 off this soundtrack. Okay, soundtrack number 2 for this is actually the Nintendo 64 port. It only had 9 songs instead of the standard 10 songs, and they were not as high of a quality as the other 2 systems I just mentioned earlier. So this one only had 9 songs, and I am just going to tell you what the best song of that soundtrack is, and that is Superman by Goldfinger again. I want my mini! Give me the mini, please! Next up, we're talking about Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. So the Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 soundtrack came with 15 songs in the original release. My top 3 from this soundtrack is You by Bad Religion. I thought that was a pretty good song myself. Number 2 is Pin the Tail on the Donkey by Naughty by Nature. I love the beats. Hip hop beats work so well in Tony Hawk, and I think Pin the Tail on the Donkey has such a good flow that I just want to skate to, brother. And number 1, the theme song to Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 was Guerrilla Radio by Rage Against the Machine. The Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 soundtrack for the Korean market had a Korean soundtrack that featured 7 unique songs from the K-pop band
FinKL.
They don't really work for Tony Hawk, because when I think of Tony Hawk Pro Skater music, I don't think of slow songs, I don't think of slow romantic songs, and for those poor Korean skateboarders, they got such an unfitting soundtrack. But they did get a bop. They got one hell of a bop that could have worked across the board, could have been released on any Tony Hawk soundtrack, and it would have worked. It's called Feel Your Love. There's a little thing called an iOS, and in 2010, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 was ported to that. Unfortunately, licensing issues got in the way, and you can't use Guerrilla Radio. We don't like you that much. So the developers of the port for the iOS version made a whole new soundtrack with a whole new different people. These are not nearly as expensive songs to license out, so these songs were way different. The theme to the iOS version, which is 7030 by the Lions Rampant. I will tell you, I heard some quality in there. Not bad showing from the iOS, considering all their limitations when it came to the soundtrack. Same thing could not be said for the PDA version of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. Yes, we got a PDA version, and instead of using the songs from the iOS app, again, the developers made their own soundtrack. This one only had 5 songs. It was not a strong showing, but the best song from that port is Oranger Garden Party for Murder Pride. If you think we're done, you got a lobotomy. We still have Tony Hawk 2X to talk about. X is pretty much the same soundtrack as Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, but it did have some other songs added for the Xbox exclusive. Best song from the Xbox exclusive is Front End. We're going to talk about the 64 version for Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. My God, the first soundtrack was so nice on the 64. This one is starting to sound like hot garbage. There were 7 songs. They were edited like crazy. And most of the songs are like instrumental, and then you have like a small little clip of a chorus. It's garbage. The best song off of this soundtrack is Cyclone. So yeah, that was all the many ports of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. Lots of soundtracks. I was not expecting all that for one game, but here we are. Next up is Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3. Okay, we're going to ramp it up. The last soundtrack was 15 songs. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 is now 21 songs. Number 3 is Cut Chemist Suite by Ozamati. Number 2 is... And number 1 is, oh my god, one of my favorite songs from this entire series. The song is called If You Must by Del the Funky Homo Sapien. But you want to see me be sad? You want to see me be terrible? The Tony Hawk 3 64 port completely ruined it. Ruined it. But number 1 is Cut Chemist Suite, but it's still pretty bad. Screw that! I want to hear some tunes! Right here next to me is an advertisement for an actual CD that came out at that time, which was the CD entitled Music From and Inspired by Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3. This was a full CD that went to release, and it's not the soundtrack, it's music that kind of sounds like it could be from a Tony Hawk soundtrack. And number 1 was a song I've never heard before, which is surprising. It's Bombs Over Baghdad by Outkast. That song is, wow, fantastic. Alright, we are now done with Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, and now Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 takes the stage. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 had to be needlessly complicated for no reason. Okay, so we have 35 tracks, but we have 2 PC exclusive tracks, and we have 9 Polish tracks. My number 3 pick for Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 was Seneca Falls by the Distillers. 2, House of the Rising Drum by Delinquent Habits. And number 1 is Express Yourself by the NWA. So now we're going to talk about the Polish tracks. There were 9 Polish tracks. Most of them included some rap. My favorite Polish track out of the bunch was CNE and WSZ Jack. Alright, we are now done with the pro skaters for now. We are now into Tony Hawk's Underground. One of the things I like about the Tony Hawk Underground soundtrack is because the name of the game is Underground, it was very easy for them to get underground rappers to say Underground. And there's actually a couple of unique songs made for this game just for the soundtrack. And it is very, very good. I do really appreciate it. My number 3 was Raps on Deck by Ace Alone. Number 2 was Blah Blah by Frog One. I will say Frog One with Blah Blah was one of my favorite rap songs. It's really stuck out in my brain. But my number 1 pick is, I will admit, a very nostalgic pick, which is Armageddon by Alkaline Trio. Tony Hawk Underground right here had a Game Boy Advance port. Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Get out of here, because we are now going to be talking about your sequel, Tony Hawk Underground 2. Underground 2 was way more chaotic than its predecessor, and I think the soundtrack is a wonderful pairing for it. This thing is very chaotic in the sense of it not only just plays really loud punk, really great hip-hop, it also includes some very wild picks. My top 3 is That's Life by Frank Sinatra, one of my favorite songs. I just love That's Life, and I really have to thank Tony Hawk Underground 2 for showing this song to me. My number 2 is Added Up by the Violet Femmes, and number 1, such a perfect song for a Tony Hawk game. It's called Fall Back Down by Rancid. The Game Boy Advance port for Tony Hawk Underground 2 is what inspired this entire video. It is so bad. Like, kudos for trying, but this is awful.
Yeah.
Hey kids, look who came to dinner. It's Tony Hawk American Wasteland. Tony Hawk American Wasteland had 64 songs. For those who have never played Tony Hawk American Wasteland, the entire game takes place in California. The game developers actually was putting some more effort into the soundtrack, and they featured a lot of bands who are from California. My number 3 is Burn Hollywood Burn by Public Enemy. Number 2 is Oingo Boingo, Who Do You Want to Be? And my number 1 is something that is just, I love the song so much, and it's also from a California native. It is What's Up Fat Lip by Fat Lip. On Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, there's actually a lot more made for this game soundtrack songs. They brought in a whole bunch of bands together, like Fall Out Boy, like Alkaline Trio, and they brought them into a studio to make covers of classic punk and rock songs for the game soundtrack specifically, which is extremely cool. I love the effort put into this soundtrack. And all that effort got a physical release. And it had 13 tracks. It was missing a couple of the covers that they recorded, but it was released and sold to stores. And my number 1 was Institutionalized by Senses Fail. American Skateland was a DS port of American Wasteland, and it was released for the DS. It had a very limited soundtrack, and not the massive 64. Instead, it only had 13 tracks. So the best of those 13 tracks was Tommy Guerrero's Organism, Green Day's Holiday, and Oingo Boingo's Who Do You Want to Be? Surprisingly enough, American Skateland also had a Game Boy Advance port. Next soundtrack is not from a soundtrack from any of the mainline games. It is Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam. Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam was not developed by Neversoft. It was developed by, I believe, Toys for Bob. So Neversoft is not responsible for making the soundtrack. So when I first heard that, I was like, well, I hope it's good. And guess what? It was. My top 3 songs right here is Here's a Smirk by Charisma and PB Wolf. Atlas Velocity is a song by Thursday, which is my number 2 pick. It is a song about going at extremely high speeds, really fast, which Downhill Jam is a racing game that you just go extremely fast. So I thought it was really appropriate because that's the main focal point of the game. And number 1 is Kick Push. Kick Push is by Lupe Fiasco. Chill hip-hop beat, all about skateboarding. It is such a wonderful love letter to the sport, and it is a fantastic song. Downhill Jam had a DS port, and this one only had 15 songs and not the regular 40. So this one, for some reason, removes all the rap from it, and there was lots of rap in Downhill Jam, so that was a kind of a weird choice because all the other DS ports try to keep that variety. But anyway, and number 1 was the Loved Ones with their song Suit Yourself. I thought that was a pretty high-octane song that really fit well with the game. And Downhill Jam, for some reason, also had a Game Boy Advance port. Tony Hawk's Project 8. Tony Hawk Project 8 had 56 songs on this soundtrack. If you were playing on last gen on PS2, you would be playing it with 5 additional songs added. Since they had less content, they could have added more songs, and that's one of the reasons why right there. Number 3 was Punk Rock Girl by the Dead Milkman. Number 2 is the theme of Project 8. It is Clubfoot by Caspian. It's what plays every single time you start up the game, and it plays at like the final levels of the game. It really gets your blood pumping when you play it, and you're like, yeah, that's right, I'm playing Project 8, my guy, my dude. My number 1 song for Project 8 is Summer Madness by Kool and the Gang, which is a wonderful instrumental track. Shake your head, Tony, you agree. Next up is a soundtrack I think could have been done way, 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 way better. And that is the soundtrack for Tony Hawk's Proving Ground. Proving Ground was the last Tony Hawk game made by Neversoft. It is a soundtrack that is way more rock-oriented than it is hip-hop oriented. They focus more on screamo and death metal, but that's not saying there isn't some kind of switch-ups throughout the whole thing. For those who are not familiar with the Tony Hawk Proving Ground, Everything is separated in 3 different types of like lifestyles. You have the hardcore skaters, you have the career skaters, and you have the riggers. And most of the soundtrack is more oriented to something that you would think a hardcore skater would listen to. But they could have made like 3 different curated playlists for each of the careers, and whatever career path you could have picked, you could have had the different soundtracks for each different style of kind of person you would be in the game. I'm not saying Proving Ground has a bad soundtrack, but this soundtrack could have had a lot more potential, which I just feel like they kind of dropped the ball a little bit on. My top 3 is Rappin' and Rockin' the House by the Funky 4+1. Great song. Listen to it immediately. Number 2 is Dag Nasty Circles. And number 1 is Nirvana Breed. Tony Hawk Proving Ground also had a DS version. So that also had to be listened to. It had 13 tracks on it. And number 1 again is Nirvana Breed. Welcome to the dark period. Welcome to the period where no one really gave a shit when it came to their goddamn soundtracks. So now we have Tony Hawk Motion, almost like a DS demo of a Tony Hawk game without really being a Tony Hawk game. It did not have any licensed tracks, but it did have one cool song on there, which was called Skatebox. Next up is Tony Hawk Ride. Tony Hawk Ride soundtrack is a lot more aimless than other soundtracks. They're trying to appeal more to a wider market, and that reflects with the Tony Hawk soundtrack, and which really does not work. And I'm not saying most of these songs are bad songs. By themselves, they're fine. But for a Tony Hawk game, they do not fit. They do not work. My top 3 is TSOL Dance With Me. The Meters had a great song called Sissy Strut, which is a great instrumental track. And then number 1 was Replacements with Takin' a Ride. This next one is the worst soundtrack out of all of them. Worse than Tony Hawk Underground 2 on Advance. This is the worst soundtrack. That's Tony Hawk Shred. These songs right here, they're not bad songs on their own, but they do not work when it comes to Tony Hawk songs. The majority of Tony Hawk songs are anti-government songs. It's anti-establishment songs, and what they put on Tony Hawk Shred is Beach Boys, I Get Around, Rock Around the Clock, Jump, Jive, and Wail, an Over the Rainbow cover from The Wizard of Oz. Tony Hawk is not about the most recognizable bands. Again, it's about underground, people who have not had a chance to show off their stuff. Number 3 was Sam and Dave's Soul Man. I really don't know if it works that well for Tony Hawk, but I like the song Soul Man. Number 2 is Iggy and the Stooges' Search and Destroy. And number 1 was Devo, Uncontrollable Urge. Uncontrollable Urge could be on any Tony Hawk game. It was a kick-ass song. I swear I'm going insane. There are so many freaking soundtracks. Okay, now we're talking about Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD, baby. It was not as loved as all the other games, but it did have a pretty sweet soundtrack. And my number 1 spot is freaking Goldfinger Superman. I think that goes as no surprise, because this is pretty much the theme song for the entire Tony Hawk series. They named the documentary of the entire game franchise after this. We're not just talking about soundtracks to games that released, we're also going to talk about a soundtrack to a game that got canceled and did not get a wide release. That is the iOS game that got canned, Tony Hawk Shred Session. So the soundtrack is really nothing special. It's a lot of instrumental tracks that were licensed out for the game. But there was one song in particular where I listened to it and I was like, wait a second, I've heard that before. The track is my number 1. It's called Skateboarder _Car. I listened to it and I was like, wait a second. And then I looked it up, and this is the theme song to the Brian Kendrick, a wrestler from 2009 who I very vividly remember because I loved his theme song. I laughed my ass off because I was like, wait a second, this is the instrumental version to that song. It was awesome. It was awesome. It was awesome. Next up is Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5. Okay, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5. Terrible game. People hate this game. But I will have you know, the soundtrack is not that bad. In fact, it is a very good return to form for the series when it comes to soundtracks. These are my top 3. My top 3 is the Orwells with the song Who Needs You. Number 2 was the only really old school song. Usually they have a lot of older songs mixed in with the newer songs, but the only older song I could find was from the band Death with Keep On Knockin'. And number 1 is a song, I really can't tell you why I like it so much. It's Bully with her song Milkman. Tony Hawk Skate Jam was another app that was released for iOS and Android. What is unique about this soundtrack is these are 14 songs that Tony Hawk has personally selected for this game. So you get a small little look into the personal playlist of the Hawk Man. Number 1 is Starcrawler, which is a song called I Love LA. Great song. I wish this came out a lot earlier, because if this did, it would have fit right at home with American Wasteland. Lastly, we are here. We are at the final soundtrack, which is from the remake, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 included the soundtrack of the first game and the second game, and added their own tracks to have such a unique experience. I did like number 3 with A Tribe Called Quest. They had a song called Can I Kick It? My number 2 track is Fiddlar's West Coast. And my number 1 track for Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2. Surprise!